Mirë se erdhët në Public Square, unë jam Ditmir Bushati. Sot kam ftuar Marc Saxer, drejtor të fondacionit Friedrich Ebert për Azinë dhe Paqësorin, me cilin dëshiroj që të bëjmë një udhëtim imagjinar nëpër kontinentet kryesore, Europë, Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës dhe Azi, për të kuptuar më mirë dinamikat e konkurencës mes aktorëve të mëdhenj në këtë situatë krejtësisht re gjeopolitike që po jetojmë. Impaktin që ajo ka tek jeta jonë e përditshme. Welcome to Public Square, dear Marc.
Thank you for having me.
I would like to start our conversation by asking you a specific question in relation to the great power competition that is being played out in three regions, in Europe, in Middle East, and in East Asia. And with two hot wars in Europe and in Middle East, and the one looming in the third, what are the main consequences for Europe after the end of Pax Americana?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important that you underline that there are actually three potential theaters of geopolitical competition and even, as you hinted, geopolitically motivated wars. That would be Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. We have to acknowledge, of course, that geopolitical competition is played out worldwide in the Arctic just as well as in the Sahel zone and the Pacific Islands just as much as in South America. But these three regions represent the theaters where the interests of the great powers, and they're mostly United States, Russia, as well as China, are affected in such a way that there is, number one, a challenge to a US hegemony in the region, as well as a potential of escalations towards war and even towards the nuclear threshold. So our focus needs to be on these three theaters, and Europe being one of them. Obviously, we have seen the first of such kind of wars in Ukraine, still ongoing, and that is maybe a sign of what could be to come. What we need to understand from a geopolitical point of view, and I think that is very important for our European friends to understand, is that there is a zero-sum game. There is tensions and dynamics between these three theaters. Obviously, three theaters of war have the potential of overstretch for the United States to be engaged in all three of them simultaneously, maybe even in a war. And that means there will be trade-offs. So if we look at the current debates that are going on between the Americans and the Europeans over the so-called burden shift within NATO, then the idea is obviously that the United States want to finally pivot towards Asia to engage in the geopolitical competition with China with all its resources and offload the responsibility for the security of Europe onto European shoulders. At the same time, there are trade-offs between the theater of war in the Middle East as well as in Europe. If you imagine that, for instance, the conflict between Israel and Iran could escalate further, then you could imagine that this would also have implications for the abilities to support Ukraine in its war effort against Russia. Vice versa, the same logic applied when Syria was overrun by Turkish-sponsored militia. It was basically Iran as well as Russia being engaged in their respective wars that actually opened the window of opportunity for these militias to take over the Assad regime. So I think we need to understand that there are trade-offs between the theaters and that these kind of geopolitical forces could be just as important to determine the outcome of conflicts such as the war in Ukraine as what is happening on the battlefield.
Speaking about the hierarchy of those theaters, we in Europe are used with the Truman Doctrine, according to which Americans were very much present. They were providing the security of the continent, and they were also assisting democratic transitions in Europe. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Americans were very much present, and they were instrumental in providing the security of the continent and also helping Eastern European countries to join NATO. Coming from Western Balkans, we have always witnessed a US which was seen as the enforcer of the security perimeter. Now with the return of Donald Trump in the White House, it seems to me that we are living in the period of a different kind of doctrine. Maybe the age of the strong man, where we see the direct involvement of US administration with Russia, and maybe potentially also with others. So how much this is going to impact this geopolitical competition into these three theaters that you have mentioned?
Well, the age of the strongman actually started before the election of Donald Trump, even before he was elected the first time as president of the United States. I think it's important to understand that all of these political shifts and geopolitical tectonic shifts that we are witnessing have to do with the re-emergence, most importantly, of China and India, but also of Russia onto the global states, which are re-establishing themselves as great powers. There is also the rise of other emerging powers in the global south. And that has actually, over the course of the last 20 years already, shifted the global balance of power, which actually affects a relative decline of the West and the end of the unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War. And that is actually what causes the end of Pax Americana, because the Americans seem to be no longer capable and maybe even willing to deter their geopolitical rivals from acting unilaterally and even cross the threshold of war. So we've seen the end of the Pax Americana already for a while, since 2022 at least, but also the new incoming Trump administration at the Munich Security Conference, you may say, has declared the US-led and US-founded and US-guaranteed liberal world order obsolete. So this actually goes to what you've been mentioning, the core values of democracy and human rights and the rule of law, which always have been part of that mission that the United States was trying to shepherd. Basically the entire world was supposed to become market-based democracies. That is what the Trump administration has declared for obsolete. And that completely changes now the game. And I think for Europeans, it is very difficult to comprehend that this, so to say, global gold standard. We still talk about, systemic rivalry between democracies and autocracies, but there is no longer any Western gold standard that actually other regimes can be measured against, because that has been declared obsolete. So we are entering a completely new world order now. We are entering, of course, we're witnessing the competition for how that new world order looks like. I think we don't really know exactly how it's going to look like. Is it really going to be multipolar, or is it going to be bipolar between the US and China forming a G2? And what kind of institutions and rules of the games will there be? It sounds a lot like we're going into a new concert of power, where the great powers actually try to balance each other and find some sort of an equilibrium, but also try to stabilize the international order through the establishment and the mutual recognitions of spheres of influence. And that, of course, is something that we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War. It was always part of European culture, but since the end of the Cold War, we have been stressing sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference into internal affairs. And spheres of influence directly challenge that. And I think that's where we're at right now. And we have to speculate how this will continue.
What is the impact, or what are the main feelings in Asia when one hears President Trump speaking about Greenland or speaking about Canada? What is the immediate impact on Taiwan, for instance, or on other hotspots in Asia?
Well, first of all, it's a language that Asians understand, because there never was a liberal world order in Asia. Asia has always been a continent, a region which had geopolitical competition. It never ended, so to say. There never been a peaceful order. There's never been much of a collective security arrangement. There's never been much multilateral institutions in the region. And there's always been war and conflict. So in that sense, the Asian perspective is pretty much that Europe has been living in an anomaly, in a historical exception, and is now returning to something that is rather normal in history. That's the first thing. The other thing is that obviously no one in Asia wants to live in a sphere of influence, right? Especially the smaller and the medium-sized states very strongly believe in the Westphalian principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, as well as non-interference. So the idea that there could be a sphere of influence, and you mentioned Taiwan, which obviously would be part of a Chinese sphere of influence if that ever came to pass, that is something that a lot of smaller and middle-sized Asian states see with great alarm. So in that sense, the European view, as well as the Asian view on what we may call a rule-based international order, not so much a liberal-based international order, is fairly similar. There is a strong wish to continue to have rules of the game. There is a strong wish to have multilateral institutions that actually enable people to tackle, the big questions, development, climate change, pandemics, these kind of things, but not in the shape of 1945. It needs to be acknowledged that the world has changed and the global balance of power of the 21st century needs to be acknowledged. I think these are the conditions that Asians would formulate in order to enter into a rule-based order 2.0, so to say, for the 21st century.
What would be the main pillars of this 2.0 order, or the end of the history as we know?
Well, I think historical determinism is a thing that never really holds up, I guess. So the history never really ends as long as there's humans on the planet. History goes on, and I think we are seeing that the horizon of history is opening up again. Ditmir, however, there is a very interesting point, and I think that may be historical first. Actually, two things. Number one, in the past, world orders always collapse, right? They're always being challenged by rising powers. But many times it is a rising superpower that actually wins the hegemonic conflict and then imposes its idea of order on the rest of the system. That seems to be not really the case right now. What we are witnessing is that all the contenders for great power status, the United States with its internal polarization, China with its economic turmoils, India with its development challenges, Russia with its demographic challenges, as well as Europe, which is so fragile as a political entity, all of them seem to be rather brittle and a little bit weak, to be honest. So I don't think that we're going to look at a victor imposing an order on the rest of them. And that means that for the very first time in history, on a global scale, we have to establish an international order that is somewhat negotiated between powers from very different civilizational backgrounds as well as historical experiences. We're going to have to somehow find a compromise between Chinese, Indian, and Western ideas of order that, of course, have some similarities, but they also can be quite different. And I think that is going to be a challenge.
Speaking about the Western order, because this is to me the key issue right now. We are witnessing a transatlantic rift, and basically we are also witnessing two different visions or two competing visions, the one coming from the US and the other one coming from key European powers or key European states. How this is going to impact the position of Europe into this world order 2.0?
Well, first of all, unfortunately, and I wish it were otherwise, I think from my personal preferences, I wish it were otherwise, but Europe doesn't have the choice to continue to live in a liberal world order if the liberal hegemon has declared this liberal order for obsolete, right? Of course, that is the preference right now of European elites. And why not? I mean, for Europe, it has been all in all a pretty stable part of their history. I mean, if we take the big historical lens, the continent that we live in has been at war with each other for hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? So we had a pretty good run when it comes to peace and prosperity. And of course, that means this liberal world order has become very dear to us. But at the end of the day, order is downstream from power, and it is the hegemon that actually guarantees an order. And if the hegemon either can no longer do it because of the capacity, again, 3 theaters of war, as well as the political will to do so, then this order is no longer actually an option on the table. What we're going into, as I said, is probably something that resembles Europe in the 19th century, a concert of power, constantly balancing each other, trying to find an equilibrium, backroom deals, not so many institutions, not so many, international law rules, etc. However, when we come to vision, and that's the question that you ask, there is one point that's going to be very, very, very tricky. And that is the question of universality. The Western vision has always been universalist. We do believe, for instance, in the universality of human rights. And I think that is our DNA. And the question is now, are we going to deal this away? Are we going to give this up? And I think that even if we have to somehow limit the goals towards our actually very limited capabilities, I think it would be foolish to give up the idea of universality of right. That is actually the lesson that we learned from 2 world wars, is that you're going to be only positivist. You do not have any legal framework that exists beyond the manipulation of humans and their fickle and arbitrary lawmaking. Actually, you open up an abyss, all right? And you open up like the eternal warfare between tribes. So I think universality needs to be something that needs to be acknowledged, but we also need to be careful not to be so intrusive in order to avoid war. And here I suggest something that I call Helsinki 2.0, basically the combination between universality but without intervention. What the East and the West, what the Americans, the Europeans, and the Soviet Union agreed upon in 1975 and 1978 was actually that the East accepted the universality of human rights, but the West accepted the existence of de facto borders and forewent the intervention into the Soviet sphere of influence. And that was actually the framework that allowed détente and actually allowed also the Eastern European uprisings in the 1980s, which led to the end of the Eastern socialist regimes, right? So universality without intervention could be a formula that could work in this new global order that has to deal with powers with different civilizational backgrounds.
What are the main pillars of this new global order? So, in security terms, we see that the global order is still being driven by U.S. because of the large-scale missions and deployments of U.S. troops around the world. In economic terms, we see a tight competition between US and China. But there is also this digital new order that we didn't touch as a part of huge impact on our daily life. And this digital order is being run and being regulated by private companies. So. And we know that there is also a competition in this respect between China and US. How do you see this digital order? What would be the impact in the new world order 2.0 that you were describing?
Well, it's an interesting point that you're raising regarding order. Maybe if we just look at the naked power constellation, it's not so easy to see how the world's going to look like in 10 years from now. To a certain degree, some of the sectors have already been multipolar for quite some years. Think about the energy sector, where the OPEC states have established their own power resources. It's been multipolar for many, many years. Other sectors, like the financial sector, are still unipolar. You still have the absolute dominance of the American financial markets, maybe with the exception of London as a trading place, right? So it's not entirely clear also how the digital order is going to look like. Certainly, you have strong competition between the US and China in this domain when it comes to AI, when it comes to quantum computing, but there's also other smaller powers like South Korea and Taiwan that are also playing a great role in this regard. So basically, one trend and one challenge need to be watched. Number one, we are witnessing the acceleration of digitalization for many, many reasons. Part of that actually have to do with COVID, because automation was one of the ideas how you can cut out the human risk factor, so to say, and increase resilience. But also, automation will allow you to reshore some of the critical sectors towards either the industrial countries or the near abroad, so to say, because it actually undercuts the cost of labor and production. And therefore, you can actually reshore or nearshore some of your supply chains and increase geopolitical resilience, right? So that's the trend. We're going to see an acceleration. There's, of course, military motivated motivations towards AI, which is supposed to be a game changer on the battlefield, some of which we're already going to see maybe in the Ukraine war. Then the question arises, if we want to have some sort of a global framework of regulation for the digital realm, how are we going to do that at the very, very moment when our multilateral structure, when our multilateral architecture is completely paralyzed by geopolitical competition? Same goes for climate change, same goes for so many things. It's like, right now, we need to have this kind of global consensus, how to deal with one of the, history-making trends. But at that very moment, the institutions that we have created to deal with this kind of challenges are blocked, right? And I think that also goes towards the idea to find, number one, some sort of compromises in the middle that allows us to tackle these kind of challenges. And I think us Europeans would be wise to create partnerships with as many countries around the world in order to tackle these questions together.
Speaking about Europe and partnerships that has to establish in order to seek these challenges around the world, I've been reading Draghi report about the future of Europe, and basically Draghi is putting US and China on the same pot, and offering some suggestions how EU should deal with US and China. And on the other hand, what we are seeing recently by President Trump reminds many scholars a reverse Kissinger approach on how to deal with big powers. So Kissinger has been advocating for a decoupling of Russia from China, and now scholars are trying to explain the diplomatic moves of US president as a reverse Kissinger approach. So what's your view on Europe in dealing with China, but in dealing also with other countries which are quite strong in Asia, but also with Africa, whether it needs to have a functional relationship with China in order to mitigate the migration risks coming from Africa in our continent? What's your view?
Well, first of all, Europe urgently needs to relearn geopolitical realpolitik. It needs to be able to maneuver in this new world of great powers, of hard power. It needs to be able to maneuver in a concert of powers. That means, for instance, if Europe right now is under enormous pressure, both by Russia as well as the United States, it needs to play the China and India card, right? The idea that we double down on the idea of a systemic rivalry with China in the very moment that we are under such pressure shows that Europe still has not actually have a mental space of strategic autonomy and sovereignty. I think that's number one, what we need to urgently learn. On the other hand, if you get into trouble with Russia and China, there is always the opportunity to also get closer with the US again. It's going to be this kind of balancing. It's going to be this kind of pendulum that Europe needs to be able to play on the great chessboard. If we're not able to play this kind of game, we're gonna be the ones who are on the menu, right? And I think the kind of discussions that we're having over such questions as Greenland right now is gonna be a foreshadowing of what happens to Europe that is too weak and geopolitically too naive actually to assure its own interests. That's a great power game. The other question is then, what kind of partnerships do we need? I think for the time being, if there's not going to be a great deal with China as well, I think also I agree with you that there's a Kissinger in reverse on the table in the negotiations between the United States and Russia in Riyadh. I don't think that anything has been agreed upon yet. I think this is more like a possibility that may obviously also collapse, but it is a possibility that shows that those two are thinking geopolitically. If there is a possibility of a deal with the US and China also remains to be seen. Don't forget that in 2020, in the last year of his presidency, President Trump actually cut the phase one deal with China, is also not entirely out of the question. However, if we assume that geopolitical strategic rivalry remains, then you're going to see that when it comes to the kind of issues that needs to be tackled, like basically economic growth and prosperity, climate change, pandemics, piracy, and all these kind of things, debt relief for countries in the global south, also a very important one. It will be very unlikely that the US is going to accept anything that has been promoted by China, and China would accept anything that's been promoted by the US. And I think this is where you need third powers to come in. Europe can play a role here together with partners in the global south that actually want to get something done. Because again, I want to stress is that when it comes to these big questions, we actually do not have time for a wasted decade, right? We need to act right now. And if the multilateral institutions are paralyzed and blocked, We cannot just sit and wait around until they are unblocked, right? And that's why I suggest Europe needs to find partners in the middle, partners that have a similar mindset when it comes to rule-based order, partners that also want to see progress on these pressing questions, and then make proposals that may actually be acceptable for Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. But I think the partnerships in the middle will have to take the lead.
My last but not the least questions as social democrats, and we're just discussing about this new geopolitical context and how to use the space in order to maneuver, and how Europe and US can work together into this different world order. But on the other hand, we have seen in the recent decade a retreat of social democracy. And now we see that the challenges are there, not only domestic but also international ones. So, what is the future of social democracy? Can we speak about the social democracy 2.0 as well?
Well, right now, I think we are at a historical juncture, and I think social democracy needs to be very, very careful to tread carefully. Let me give you 2 pointers why this is existential. And I think also it will really matter what social democrats will do in the future. Number one, if we're going to have a balance of power in Europe between Russia on the one side and Europe minus the protection on the US on the other side, we're going to have to reestablish deterrence. And that means we have to build up our capabilities for defense. Is a difficult conversation for social democrats to have, but I insist that balance of power is the prerequisite for stability and peace on the continent. That's going to cost us between 3 to 4% GDP per annum, right? Not only defense, but also infrastructure, industrial base, these kind of challenges, right? So if you look, for instance, at my country, Germany, we haven't spent anything even close to this magnitude since reunification. Most countries haven't done that in decades. Most of the political battles that we fight in day-to-day politics are about 0.1 or even less % of GDP. So it's a gigantic, enormous sum in the political economy, and there will be the mother of all distribution conflicts. Who is going to pay for this? Are we going to cut social transfers to the lower third of the population? Are we going to tax the income earners in the middle of the population, or are we going to tax the capital and wealth owners on the top third of the population? None of these options are right now feasible within our existing social contract. Basically, what we're doing is renegotiating the social contract post-1990. That is a massive thing, and I think all the political disruption that we're seeing, the rise of the populists on all sides of the political spectrum, the rise and fall of political parties are part of this epochal, earthquake that is actually happened to us. So at the very moment that we have to rebuild our states and economies, and at the very moment where we basically also have to reform the European Union to be able to actually deal with this kind of challenges. And if we do that on such a profound level, we have to change the European treaties. And that means we're going to have referenda to win. And you have a mood where it's not in favor of a deeper integration of the European Union. So gigantic challenges are happening. Something needs to happen. And at the same time, you have what I call a populist mood. What exactly is a populist mood? There's 3 elements to that. Number one, if you ask common people on the street, how things are, I think, maybe not so eloquently in 1,000 words, but on a very profound level, they understand that things cannot stay the way they were, that they're probably going to get worse. Number two, there is a deep mistrust that they're not being told the entire truth about the challenges, either because they're openly lied to, or, and that is equally concerning, because the liberal elites themselves do not understand the challenges that are happening out there. And number three, there is a strong feeling, a fear that they're going to be the idiots who actually have to pay the cost, not only in terms of money, but also with the lives of their sons and daughters at the front lines. That's the populist mood. And I think we need to tackle that in order to be able to tackle anything. And I think that means we have to actually make big changes in a situation where the legitimacy of, let's say, the democratic center is strongly being called into question. And I think that means we have to speak in a sense that we say what is going on, and we have to lay out what the challenges are, and we have to make bold changes. And I really hope that the current cohort of policymakers is up to the task.
Dear Marc, it was a pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you so much.